Hey everyone, I'm back. Professor Segrist to continue with Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his political theory, and we talked last time about his state of nature theory and the discourse on inequality, and then now we're going to look at his social contract that brings you out of the state of nature, um, and his own unique form of it, which can be compared again to Hobbes and Locke, the other two great social contract theorists. And we're also going to compare it to Edmund Burke, who presents I mean, most people wouldn't call him a social contract theorist, but he does talk about a kind of social contract. And obviously, as I said before, um, Rousseau's kind of a leading inspiration for French revolutionaries, and Burke was a leading critic of the French Revolution, and out of their thought comes something like what we would call left and right, the birth of modern ideological movements of left and right. Um, so let's get into the social contract then. This is essentially Rousseau's ideal system for achieving real equality and freedom. He wants to have what you would have had in the state of nature at its best in a context where returning to the state of nature is not possible. I mean, one of the things that Voltaire had said that would offended him about Rousseau's discourse on inequality was, man, he said, like, you want us to go back into the jungle. You want us to be, wild animals again. That's the opposite of civilization. That's what we're trying to escape. Um, and uh, and Rousseau acknowledges that you can't go back. I mean, he doesn't recommend going back. Sort of leaving the city and going out and living in nuts and berries or whatever. But he does want to sort of try to capture the best of the state of nature in the context of political society by reshaping um, the the form of political society, the way it's set up, right? Um, the social contract, in particular, was especially important for the French revolutionaries, um, and above all, on Robespierre. Now, I just need to point out, I'm going to elaborate on this later. For all his impact on the French revolutionaries, it's clear that most and perhaps not any of them really understood him. Much deeper thinker than they recognized, much more sort of nuanced and cautious than they recognized. But I mean, it might be kind of analogous to the way the Nazis used um, Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, they latched on to Nietzsche's talk of master and slave morality and took it in a very sort of literalist, crude way, and totally didn't understand Nietzsche. And in the same way, you might say the French revolutionaries totally didn't understand Rousseau, but their understanding of Rousseau was a very powerful um, guide to what they did. The the story is that Robespierre slept at night with a copy of the social contract, Rousseau's social contract, under his pillow. I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean, it sort of captures something uh, of the relation Robespierre and many others as well had with Rousseau's thought as they understood it. Um, Robespierre really idolized Rousseau and thought he was the be all and end all, in terms of the right way to think about humanity and society and so forth. Um, so the book had a big impact on the French Revolution, and you could say maybe for the development of thinking about radical democracy or left liberalism, and so on. So it's a very important book, but as I'm hinting already, it's a much more interesting book in many ways than what you would maybe get if you looked at the sort of radical uses of it. So, okay, so looking at the organization of the book, you again have some front matter, as I said, talking about the discourse and inequality. Rousseau always does interesting things at the very front of the book, like in pictures and epigraphs and so on, and that's the case here as well. Then there's four books. Um, so let me sort of give a sort of big picture of these parts, and then we'll go into more detail. So the subtitle of the book is the first thing to notice. The full title is "The Social Contract" or "The Principle of Political Right." Um, and that's important because we have a sense that he's not only talking about a kind of contract that's made and a society created by the contract, but the question of right or justice, or if you want to put it in the plural, rights, is critical to what he's trying to do. But you should take political right advisedly. He means there, and he spells this out in the book, he means to distinguish between political right and natural right. Um, and unlike the American founders, for example, and you could say Locke too, to a degree, the you know a good political system, but just society to the extent it's possible for it to be just, is what you want to do is politically um, sort of codify natural rights. Natural rights are sort of they continue to be the standard in the context of political society. Um, Whereas Rousseau here wants to replace natural right with political right. That's the irony. So he wants to kind of get back to, he wants to recover something of what's lost from the old state of nature, back before man was corrupted by civilization, the noble savage ideal and everything. He wants to capture some of that sort of natural condition, but he wants to do it through political means, and political right is essentially a replacement of natural right. Um, so that's distinctive about Rousseau compared to Locke and the American founders. Again, we see in the front matter self designation, as we did in the Discourse and Inequality. Rousseau designates himself as a citizen of Geneva, which was a small republic, right? And so you remember that in the Discourse on Inequality, in the preface, he gives this, excuse me, he gives this sort of picture of an ideal society and how to preserve it, which he presents as Geneva, and how to continue Geneva. But we pointed out that this is sort of a mythologized version of Geneva, an idealized version of Geneva, which is sort of supposed to be a picture of what an ideal society would look like, even though the real Geneva didn't actually quite look like that. Um, but still working with that idea of Geneva as a kind of, at least symbolically, model society, and the social contract, that the society that Rousseau wants to set up with the social contract is a republican society. That is a society with a popular government. And Rousseau, like the ancients, but unlike, say, James Madison, who says, well, you can make a large republic work, Rousseau emphasizes, and this he's in line with Aristotle. It says that suggests that a republic can only work on a small scale. That's another way that really Rousseau's model doesn't mesh with the French revolutionary conception of him because France is a big country, it's much bigger than the kind of republic that Rousseau would have had in mind as a workable regime. Aristotle said you can't really have a real political community larger than 10,000, very small. I mean, you can have a political unit bigger than that, obviously, but Aristotle said real community can only extend to a few degrees of separation, right? Where you know, so if your society is much bigger than that small sort of 10,000, which is almost every society is, right? Then you have to provide for sort of facsimiles, I guess you could say, or some kind of substitute for community, some widely held ideals or practices or something like that, where you in fact don't know that many people. Like so in America, I've got 310 million people now, 20, whatever it is. Obviously, only a very small percentage of Americans can we actually know. Um, and know how they think in a very personal way and all of that kind of thing. So, but Rousseau insists on a kind of direct democracy, although he says, unlike the French revolutionaries don't recognize this, but he says there's only certain conditions under which this can happen and work. Um, but ideally, what you'd want is a small republic where people can directly participate in politics, not just through voting, for representatives, but through actually voting on legislation. That's going to be his goal. But anyway, that's Citizen of Geneva. And then the quote, the epigraph that he gives in the front matter is from the Aeneid by Virgil, which is kind of a Roman version of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, right? Except for Aeneas, the Odyssey comes first, and the war comes second. It was the other way around with Homer. But this quote from the Aeneid is, in an equitable federation, we will make laws. So two words to zero in on there. First of all, equitable. Um, Rousseau the idea of equality is very important in the way he's thinking about the right kind of politics, and he thinks that um, you want to establish a kind of equal justice or equal um, arrangements, and this will be done especially by and through law. Laws are going to be a critical thing. And remember in the discourse on inequality, he had dropped the part of the essay contest question about natural law. He doesn't really speak of you know um, the the developments in the state of nature in terms of natural law, unlike Locke in a very different way Hobbes, just in terms of natural right. But he also looks at that as evolutionary. You know, morality evolves, and so on. There's an evolutionary component to his whole sort of way of looking at human nature, but we're going to set up laws. If the state of nature is not a state of law in a sense, the political state is a state of law, and that's critical. And maybe that's a critical part of replacing the natural right with political right. In any case, there's four books. Book one is on the social contract itself. Book two is on legislation, the making of these laws, how that's going to be done. Um, Book three is on the form of government or the Constitution, what Rousseau calls political laws. So, I mean, there's legislation about the different things that need to be done, but political laws are the fundamental law. So, as we say this in America, the supreme law of the land, uh, which is ultimately the Constitution, the most fundamental law. But I mean, keep in mind that the old way of talking about constitutions was something bigger than what we think of typically in America, a piece of paper with a plan of government spelled out on paper. That wasn't necessary for the thinking about constitutions back to ancient times. Constitution is the way a government is constituted, right? And so, but this is a legally established institutions that Rousseau is talking about. Part three is on that. Then part four has to do with preserving the Constitution that has been established, right? So you have making the social contract, then you're going to need laws, and you're going to need a form of government, these fundamental laws, and you're going to need to think about the way to preserve that regime, that constitution. So let's talk first about the nature of the contract. So with if you remember with Hobbes, the the social contract brings people out of the state of nature is one where people surrender all of their right, which means their right their rights in the state of nature, which by which Hobbes meant their freedom, their power. They give it all to a particular person or group of people who will um, exercise that without any restraint for the sake of keeping peace and order, right? So under with Hobbes, the not everybody's party to the contract. The contract is among us who are establishing those guys to be um, the rulers. Um, but there's a total alienation of rights in Hobbes's case to this political sovereign, to these people who are given the reins of government, right? Locke had said there's not a total alienation, there's a partial alienation of rights, and in particular, the right to rule. We give over the essential functions of government, the our natural as individual sovereigns, our natural legislative powers, executive power, judicial powers, right? I mean, in the state of nature, Hobbes says we're sort of judge, jury, and executioner. Each one of us is judge, jury, and executioner because there is no sort of human appeal, human institution to appeal to. So we're sort of on our own. But because Locke emphasizes liberty so much, he says it can only be a part. We're gonna only surrender part of our rights in order to secure the rest. Right. Rousseau, interestingly, goes back to total alienation. Rousseau says, yes, the people in making the contract all absolutely alienate all of their rights in order to get them all back. Say so that's and what because what's different in Rousseau's social contract, even though it's in a sense inspired more by Hobbes than Locke, is that we're going to alienate our rights not to particular persons but to the whole people. We all we give up all our rights to the whole, but not to any particular person, right? We give it up to the general will. So in Hobbes, again, so we fused all our will in the will of whoever those that person or people are at the top, and they effectively act on our behalf in such a way that they are an expression of our will. But now there's no such fusing of wills in relation to particular persons. It's a surrender of our rights to the whole. So, in a sense, you're surrendering individual rights for a right of the community. But because no one in particular is the recipient of all of that power given up, so, or the rights, I should say more specifically, then theoretically there's no possibility of oppression. Well, we'll work that out. But the key point here is that Rousseau's sovereignty, like Hobbes's sovereignty, is absolute. It's just that in Rousseau's case, it's absolute popular sovereignty, whereas in Hobbes, it's absolute sovereignty of a person or persons who run the government, right? Um, but that sovereignty for Rousseau is absolute, and that's a difference from, say, with the American founders, because the American founders always talked about in sort of a higher law, the law of nature, which they associated with God, under which they were all, or to which they were all accountable, and the will of the people wasn't ipso facto what is right. It wasn't the standard of right. It was just a an expression of consent, which is necessary for justice, but not sufficient for justice. Um, Rousseau seems to kind of present a sovereignty that is purely human with no higher standard. It is the standard, right? So something equivalent to Hobbes's mortal God. Hobbes had said, this Leviathan that's created by the social contract, directed by the head of the state, right? Is like a mortal God, like God on earth. Um, and there's nothing above him, so to speak, right? Um, and Rousseau says, so that he says this sovereignty of the people is inalienable, it's individual, and it's absolute. Um, but there's something tricky here about the way he understands this general will, the will of the people. Rousseau talks about in terms of the general will, and it's important to recognize he's very explicit about this. What he means by the general will is not the will of the majority. Um, and I think, I mean, it's a little hard to get a handle on. It's not entirely clear, and that's part of what's a little dangerous about it. But I think what he means by the general will, he means it as sort of a regulative ideal. Um, it it's what everybody would will if they knew what was good for each and all, right? If people knew that, they would all will that. It's an ideal in the sense that the people don't all know that, and maybe only a few could even come close to having a sense of what that general will would be. Um, but um, but it's a sort of stand-in for God's will, right? It's inerrant, it's indestructible, inalienable, indivisible, absolute. Um, but it, but I think to avoid misuse of the concept here, you have to recognize that it's more of an ideal than an actual concrete reality, as Rousseau understands it, I think. Well, another key element of this in Rousseau's thinking is what he calls the lawgiver. He talks about this sort of mysterious figure he calls the lawgiver, someone who knows the general will, unlike most people, because again, most people, either not reflected enough or perhaps don't have the capacity to think about what would be good for each and all. Um, and so only relative few. And so there's maybe a suggestion that this is a philosopher of some kind. But the lawgiver is somebody who knows the general will, or at least knows it better than anyone else. And Rousseau gives to this lawgiver, this philosophical lawgiver, if you will, gives him the position of proposing laws or recommending laws for the people's consideration. He doesn't make the laws, and this is a kind of important check in the way Rousseau presents it. The people vote on the laws. The lawgiver can't actually create the law. He can't enact the law. He can only recommend laws, right? And the people don't recommend them, but the people, and by that I mean people who actually come to the city hall or whatever, actually vote on things, whatever the convention is, going to be bigger than City Hall, maybe, but this small republic, Geneva, they're going to come in. They're going to actually vote on things. They're not going to have the power to propose them, but the lawgiver who proposes them is not going to have the power to vote on them. And so there's sort of built-in check on both sides, you could say. But these notions, Rousseau's notions of sovereignty, general will, this kind of lawgiver uniquely understands what's good for the people. These, misunderstood as they were, became sort of a source of a lot of extreme thinking and action in the French Revolution. And there's two other things I'll just single out. You can point to a lot of other stuff, but two other things in the social contract that I think influenced bad tendencies in the French Revolution. One of them is where Rousseau says people who don't see the wisdom of the general will and vote against it, right, may have to be forced to be free. And that sounds a little ominous, right? In addition to sounding a little oxymoronic, but I think what he means by that, is since not everybody's going to see the general will clearly, they're not going to always know what's best for them and for everybody, and they won't realize what really is necessary to sort of let everybody have that kind of freedom that they're supposed to have in this political arrangement. But what it sort of sounds like is a recipe for heavy-handed coercion. Or at least that's where it went in the French Revolution. The second thing I had in mind to add on that note is Rousseau talks about needing a censor. He appeals to the old Roman censor. So censorship, not in an extreme way. I mean, again, Rousseau's sort of careful about this. He means, and he specifies, the censor is someone who regulates moral public opinion, but not by sort of disallowing or what we might call canceling, right? Someone, or punishing someone, prisoning someone, executing someone, any of those things for unhelpful opinions or opinions like greatly at odds with the general will. They would do that simply by artful public rebuke. And he sort of says how you can do it artfully. But again, in the French Revolution, this idea of censorship does become something more like canceling someone, and that cancellation often took the form of not just sort of ostracism, and disabilities in in participation or whatever, but often much worse as well. One last thing, just to point out about the social contract in terms of its content, is what Rousseau says about civil religion. And this is a very interesting thing. Rousseau feels that Hobbes was right in recognizing the importance of religion in the impact on society. Hobbes, Hobbes thought, having lived through part of the 30 Years War in Europe, lived during that time, and having personally experienced the English Civil War, both of which were heavily, religion was a heavy part of it, significant part of it, right? I mean, it's not that simple, but certainly the 30 Years' War was the cap of a long period of conflict between Catholics and Protestants. The English Civil War, Protestants, Puritans, in their sort of um, revolt against the what they considered to be a deviant form of Christianity and the Anglican Church. They were very much part of the English Revolution. Of course, you got established a Puritan sort of republic coming out of the English Civil War, and then of course that ended up in a Puritan dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. Um, and so I mean, so religion was a problem. It was a problem also for Locke, who thought um, had a different solution. Hobbes said basically you want the government to co-opt religion. Religion plays an important social role, but you can't have religion at odds with the state. So his solution wasn't separation of church and state, but subordination of the church to the state, right? And all ultimate sort of decisions in case of conflict about beliefs or practices in religion would be settled by the state. Locke, it's more like a church state separation, but you could say also very significantly a privatization of religion. Right. Rousseau thinks Hobbes was right that religion plays an important public role, and that there's sort of a built-in need for something like that. But Rousseau's thinking more along the lines of ancient religion, so where you had a church, a a a state cult of religion. I mean, there's a religion that is identified with the state, that supports the state, right? That's vital for the legitimacy of the state, and so on. And so Rousseau offers a kind of replacement for traditional religion, a civil religion, which you could look at as in terms of kind of minimum required dogma for the benefit of society. So, Rousseau, for example, says, you have to believe that God is, sort of rewards the good and punishes the evil, um, and things like that. But also, he says, religious intolerance will not be tolerated. Um, and I mean, he kind of suggests that, and the way he formulates it, it seems to rule out traditional religion. Like traditional religion maybe shouldn't have any public role because he thinks it will be intolerant. Um, and but I mean, you can think about this in relation to maybe to the American Declaration of Independence. It's been said that there's a kind of civil religion suggested in the American Declaration of Independence. There's several references to God, but it's non-sectarian. I mean, it doesn't appeal to any particular religion, but it does suggest beliefs about that we're created with inalienable rights, that there is a divine legislator, higher law, the laws of nature and nature's God, that there's a supreme judge of the world that holds to account, right? That there's divine providence, concerned with the well-being of mankind, etc. And Rousseau thinks that's all good. I mean, it seems that the political theory of the Declaration of Independence, the fundamental principles there, or at least the way they're presented, sort of presupposes this transcendent dimension, or at least a transcendent standard. And Rousseau wants to suggest that that's important. So he agreed with Voltaire, unlike a lot of the French intellectuals, to think that it's religion is a good properly conceived, right? That there needs to be a belief in God, or else, you know, as Voltaire put it, if there was no God, we would have to invent one because so something has to play that role of sort of an ultimate standard, I guess you could say. But in any case, that's an important sort of religious solution that he offers. And you could say, if you take the Declaration of Independence, the principles of the Declaration of Independence as a kind of civil religion, it obviates that problem of sectarian religious conflict, right? It's like, I mean, you could say some people would say, that's exclusionary. Just the fact that you're appealing to God, but nonetheless, it's this minimum dogma, you know, and it's not demanding in terms of how you're supposed to practice your religion or how I mean within limits. You can't be sacrificing children to Moloch or whatever, but um, you know, uh, religion, church and state can be arranged in such a way to have a healthy effect if it's if the sectarian differences are toned down, um, if not eliminated, but still retaining that sort of architecture of value and principles uh, that a belief in God would contribute. So anyway, so summing up in terms of Rousseau, his social contract, and the French Revolution, let me just point out some things, sum it up in terms of his influence and also in terms of how he was misread. So, first of all, there is Rousseau's assumption that inequality is sort of per se a great evil, right? Specifically, socioeconomic inequality. And of course, that's a big part of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is motivated to overthrow the feudal order, right? And just the mere fact that there is this um, gradations of this hierarchical society, these structures of traditional authority that exercise more power than the ordinary people and so forth. Um, this was this was sort of wrong per se, and that anyway that inequality was the big problem, right? So that's very much in the French Revolution. Um, then a notion of progress towards a perfect republic is again Rousseau gives plenty of hints that what he's doing in the social contract is more of a thought experiment. Here's a sort of ideal city to serve as an inspiration, to serve as a something to try to approximate. But he sort of never really says, this is unconditionally like what you have to aim for in politics. That is the way it was taken in the French Revolution, but the progress towards a perfect republic so became the ideal of progress on the left, you could say. Then in the discourse on inequality, he mentions something that has an impact. I'm talking about mainly about the social contract, but I want to bring this in here. There's a, a line where Rousseau suggests, if we could just start from scratch, if we could just have a clean sweep and like, sort of, sweep away everything that we had before and start over, that would be the ideal scenario. And that relates to the French Revolutionary sort of total revolution idea. They want a clean sweep. This is one of the things that Burke is going to be very critical of, you know, that to have a clean sweep, you have to do a whole lot of destruction. Um, and but that approach to politics that you can just start over, like get the right system and then just, sweep away all of the old traditions and you know, every bit of the structures that came before and so forth, start over. That's an important influence on the French Revolution. The absolute sovereignty of the people, and you can maybe put the people with a capital T and a capital P. I mean, the people's almost sort of there's an apotheosis. The people becomes a kind of mortal god, and it's spoken of in mystical terms. You definitely get that in the French Revolution. The idea of a leader who's uniquely in tune with the true will of the people, something Robespierre picked up on. I mean, he had seemed to identify himself with Rousseau's lawgiver, right? He really knew the general will of people, and no one else did nearly as well as he did. And so, what he thought needed to be done is what should be done. And if people didn't agree with that, well, they were in disagreement not with him as an individual, but with the general will, and that cannot be tolerated, and so forth. Right? And that sort of goes along with the forced to be free idea. Like you need to go along with the requirements of the revolution as presented by people who are in touch with the general will for your own good, um, for your own freedom, ultimately. But what this means is it can't be tolerated if you don't go along, right? So you don't see what's being done as well, actually being good for you, and actually, inclining towards greater freedom for you or whatever. Then you either have to comply or you can't be tolerated. So this line of thinking sort of led to the concept of enemies of the people. And Rousseau, talked a lot about enemies of the people. Of course, the Bolsheviks and the communists picked up on that phrase as well. But let me again just sum up the misreadings of Rousseau. I've already suggested some, but just sort of to encapsulate a few more points. I already mentioned that Rousseau's project is really more of a Platonic ideal standard and thought experiment. So that's a really fundamental misreading, that they took this as a practical program that one size fits all, etc. Rousseau said there are preconditions for this to work. It's kind of unlikely for those conditions to come together. He talked about the need for checks and balances. He spoke, cautiously about revolution and said revolution is best to be avoided. It should only be undertaken under certain circumstance. I mean, there was always kind of checks and cautions that he implies or states outright that were ignored by maybe not the most careful readers. Rousseau said at one point in the social contract, he says, "I don't know how to make myself clear to those who don't know how to read carefully." That line was missed, I suppose, by a lot of people. They weren't reading carefully enough to note that and to take that to heart. But in any case, and then on religion, the French Revolution really took a strongly anti-religious cast, specifically anti-Christian, even more specifically anti-Catholic. Um, but Rousseau's not, as I suggested a second ago, he's not anti-religious, and he's not really even anti-Christian per se. He just speaks sort of positively about the gospel in its pure form. I mean, kind of like Jefferson does in the American context. Says, well, Christianity has been corrupted and it's gotten away from its original understanding, and in its true pure form, it's really a beautiful thing and it's great. But it is also true, on the other hand, that Rousseau thought, he agreed with Machiavelli that religion is politically deficient or counterproductive and often intolerant also. And so, Christianity, right? Not religion necessarily, but Christianity in particular. Christians are not. They don't tend to be very civic minded in his understanding, right? They don't, and they tend to be intolerant when they you know, or have a public role, tend to be exclusionary, etc. Uh, he thinks that's maybe not true Christianity, but that's been the tendency. So Christianity is problematic from a political point of view. That is true for Rousseau, but again, he wasn't anti-religious. So that's Rousseau. That's Rousseau in relation to the French Revolution. Next lecture, I will look at Burke's critique of the French Revolution and sort of by implication Rousseau in some respects. And I'll flesh out with Burke, sort of the ideological developments of left versus right as he sort of sets the stage for. All right. Well, thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you later.